IVM.
We'd like to thank Storytel for sponsoring this show. Storytel is an audiobook platform that lets you hear hundreds of thousands of stories on your mobile, PC, wherever you prefer. Now, generally, Storytel is a great deal at $2.99 a month for an unlimited number of books, but for our listeners, we've got something special. The first month for IVM listeners is now just $99. That's an insane deal. It's $200 off the first month. To start you off, let me recommend one of my favorite books, Range, How Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. This is a book by David Epstein and is one of the most thoughtful books I've read recently. He talks about early specialization and why that's not necessarily the best way to go in a modern world where problems are not always simple and viewing them from multiple lenses are helpful. In the Indian context where we're forced to choose science, commerce, or arts in the 10th standard, I think this is particularly applicable and it's a great read. So go to storytel.com/IVM, go get your first month at just $99 and check out Range by David Epstein. Great read.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. About a year ago now, when the lockdown first began, I found myself installing Reddit on my smartphone and instantly found myself coming across a meme which usually represented a poorly illustrated mannequin sort of character taking some actions which would not necessarily be profitable in the real world, but which would apparently be profitable in the meme world, and usually end with a little photo of the mannequin wearing a suit, smirking, standing in front of a little stock market exchange sign proclaiming the word Stonks. I would never have thought that the memers who were making memes about Stonks, arguably one of the most widely used phrases in internet meme culture, I would never have suspected that these would be the same people who, about a year later, would basically bring major Wall Street hedge funds to their knees. As you can imagine, there's a pretty interesting phenomenon even in the context of the crazy stuff that goes down on the internet on a day-to-day basis. And it also really brings up a lot of interesting questions, from the question of how exactly a bunch of people sitting on an internet forum were essentially able to cause billions of dollars worth of losses to major companies on Wall Street. And it also brings up the question of how exactly this kind of coordinated economic action has been responded to by state structures, and more importantly, what kind of lessons and what kind of consequences it might have for platforms and their liability for stuff like this, and what it might mean for the future. So there's a lot to really get into this episode, and so it's a pleasure to be here today with Rohan and Prateek. Thank you guys for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having us.
So let's begin by starting to understand what precisely went down. Rohan, how exactly did Stonks turn from a meme into an actual thing that happened on Wall Street?
Okay, so this is really interesting. I'm going to explain this in the simplest way possible without any nuance. So the thing that happened here is there's this company called GameStop. I don't know if you've ever been to one of their stores. It's basically a big room in most places, and it's got a bunch of PlayStation games, right? And the thing with GameStop is that you can go to GameStop and buy those games, but increasingly people are buying PlayStation or Xbox games from the digital stores, right? So it's basically a failing business in some sense. There's discussion on whether or not they can adapt to the online world. I have my doubts about that, but generally it's a failing business, right? And the pandemic made it worse. And so a bunch of hedge funds had basically decided that they're going to bet against the GameStop, and so they went short on it. Basically, the idea is that hedge funds predicted that this thing was going to fail, and they put their money where their mouth is. Now, a bunch of people on Reddit, on a subreddit called Wall Street Bets. And I don't know if you've been to Reddit, listeners, but if you've gone there, it's very hard to say what kind of logic is just going to drive Redditors to do things. Like the weirdest things can just be a common mobilizing cause for a subreddit. And in this case for GameStop, what this subreddit called Wall Street Bets did is that they basically went against what the Wall Street people had been saying and started investing in GameStop. And because that, the price of the share just kept going up. And so that it went up to such a ridiculous degree that two hedge funds got bankrupt. I don't know if I'm using the term bankrupt right, but you get the message, right? And so that's basically what happened. A bunch of hedge funds said that this business is going to fail. The subreddit bet against that, and because it was just such a large community of investors, the price went up really fast, and so the hedge funds were in trouble. And so that's basically what happened here, without short selling explanations necessary. Any questions on that, Anirudh, Pratik?
I mean, I can say from experience that yes, subreddits just have such interesting cultures. It's kind of difficult to see what might drive them nuts.
I think the strongest one is for the lulls, right?
Yeah, for the lulls. And then I don't know if either of you guys are Star Wars fans, but there's this one particular subreddit called Prequel Memes, which essentially has turned almost every single scene in Star Wars into a meme. And they use lines from the movie as part of their kind of vocabulary. So, for example, people will constantly, if you say hello there on any other subreddit, people will probably say hi. But if you say hello there on prequel memes, then people will reply calling you General Kenobi, because that is a line from the third Star Wars movie. It's just really interesting.
I think we should share some of our favorite subreddits in the show notes if possible. I think that would be make for an interesting read. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. All right. But coming back to the topic. So now we've talked about how basically all these major hedge funds on Wall Street lost a whole bunch of money. So first, let's talk about how this organization kind of happened. Has this kind of coordinated kind of price or basically kind of a crowd coming together to manipulate the stock market ever happened before? Is there a precedent for this kind of thing happening? And given the kind of reaction that happened, especially from the Securities and Exchange Commission of the USA, do you see this kind of thing as potentially happening in the future? Because one really interesting thing that happened after this whole stock market bonanza is that a whole bunch of subreddits kind of exploded, making memes about it, about how, we've brought Wall Street down, let's go and bring down Nestle next, that kind of thing. So where do you guys see this going?
Yeah, so to your question of, has this happened before? I think as far as I know, we don't have it documented that it's happened before, but the internet being the internet, a number of things would have happened that we never really know about them, or we never really figure out. Right? What's also interesting with the way this is now playing out, and what a lot of cynics who are watching this stock price go up will also tell you that what goes up must come down. I'm not sure what the situation will be between the time we record this and we air this. But as things stand, the GameStop stock is dropping in value, and a lot of retail investors have lost money as well, right? So it's not only been the hedge funds that have been impacted. It's been, I think, a bunch of retail investors as well. So coming back to the point of this coordinated activity, right? Now, coordinated activity may be in the, in terms of trading, like I said, not necessarily been documented, but I think coordinated activity on the internet has always been around, right? An example that we've often discussed in the past is what a whole bunch of TikTok teams did to the Trump rally, right? But essentially that's what the internet does, right? It helps you scale and mobilize and coordinate these sort of movements, right? A great recent example would be the toolkit that Greta Thunberg tweeted out. Right? That's also an example of using the internet as a way to coordinate movements of this sort. Right? Now, in this case, it was just that. What's also interesting to me is that while there is a financial motive, there's also a political angle to this. Right? It's about the small guy taking on the big guy and making them pay for all these years of gaming the stock market.
Yeah, I believe some people from Wall Street Bets who've been interviewed on live television have said it's basically a class war at this point, and there's a lot of how do I put this? I think one of the big reasons why it's not just Reddit but also Twitter that's kind of celebrating this entire thing is that there's this very real sense of grievance that in 2008 basically a lot of these hedge funds were bailed out. And a lot of people hold them to account for causing the 2008 housing bubble, which, I mean, I understand. But now they're like, you've put us through 2 recessions. Now we're going to make you pay for it, and we don't care if we lose money in the process. So yeah, there's definitely a political angle to this as well, and I think that to an extent helps explain one of the reasons why this trend really caught on and exploded and got as far as it did. But what I'm really trying to understand, Pratik, is whether this is going to lead to more of this sort of thing in the future. Like, given that, for example, as soon as these hedge funds began to lose billions, the Robinhood app, which a lot of these smaller investors were using to buy these shares, basically shut down retail investment, right? So it was only the big firms that could continue to trade. And I find this to be like a sort of interesting parallel to, for example, let's say that a bunch of people protest. They manage to coordinate a lot of what they're doing through the internet. Then one way in which
Yeah.
governments are trying to shut it down is by basically cutting people off from these platforms by cutting off access to mobile internet. We've seen this happening in India fairly often. And very similarly, you see the deplatforming emerging as a kind of tool to stop people from engaging in this kind of coordinated behavior. So do you see workarounds? Do you see open source platforms coming up where people are able to do this? Or do you see it as more of a kind of a flash in the pan kind of occurrence?
That's interesting because the Robin Hood decision to prevent trading on those stocks, right? Some of it, while it was given a conspiratorial angle, there also was from what I've understood of it, there also was a question of them having to put up the deposits for them, for to be able to continue trading those stocks, and that was one of the main driving reasons behind freezing trading on those particular stocks. Right now, it can become a sort of, I don't know, I won't say whack-a-mole, whack-a-stock game, because there are already talks of switching stocks, right? Of moving this to another stock. So,
Yeah.
And if people are coordinating off, I know Reddit was a major thing, but I believe there was also significant presence on Discord, which ultimately got taken down.
Correct.
Right? It depends now. If this sustains beyond one or two stocks or a couple of months, right? It becomes a larger movement. It's going to be interesting to see how people respond. Now, there's one angle there, because it's a question of how long people are willing to lose money also. And unlike a typical political movement, I'm qualifying these words, where you're participating with attention, right? To some extent, and here you're also putting money
Yeah, putting
into
money
it,
where your
right?
mouth
So
is, literally.
correct, right? You're putting money in one. So it depends on how much of a stamina there is to do that, right? There is another angle to it, which I've seen being discussed, is that this is indeed a way to manipulate the market. Then it's a matter of time before some of the hedge funds themselves and the big investment firms themselves start trying to game these type of movements, right?
That's interesting.
Yeah, and that's easier said than done, because there is so much chaos in these things, right? You never know what is going to pick up. But having said that, the internet is a great place for this sort of coordinated manipulation, at least attempts, right? Whether this how successful they are, I think, is still a matter of debate. Depending on who you talk to, you get different views on that. But there could certainly be interest in the big guys themselves, disguising themselves, or as you'd say, wolf in sheep's clothing.
I mean, these guys. I will say that I think a lot of the change in the GameStop stock happened also, from what I understand, because other Wall Street firms also got involved and started to drive the price up, to deliberately kind of like screw over the hedge funds that had like too much exposure to GameStop. And I find that interesting because it means that either way, Wall Street is going to win. Like a few of
Yeah.
the fish that make these risky bets are going to go down under, but the sharks are still going to continue to be opportunistic. So it's not necessarily a fundamental overthrowal of the vested interests that are there here. But yeah, as you said,
There was a very interesting analogy, right? There was a very interesting analogy that I read, and I don't remember the author of the article, but I think we'll include it in the show notes. And basically, in this context of Robinhood and Wall Street, etc., right? Where Robinhood being a free app, where the user is the product, right? But he said, look, Robinhood is not a platform. Think of it as a pizzeria, and the user is the pizza.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so since we're talking about where this might lead, let's talk a little bit about how a lot of these hedge funds responded after all the bloodletting, as it were. Rohan, before this podcast started, we were chatting a little bit about how Reddit is being taken to court. What do you think that actually implies? Is there a case to be made here? What is the company's point of view on, and what does it really imply for the applicability of various laws on intermediary liability?
Hey, so good question. The thing here is we're recording this on Friday, and I think this airs on Monday, and I'm not sure how well this is going to age, but there's every chance that these hedge funds that have been doing poorly recently are gonna want their pound of flesh, so to say. So they're gonna come back and sue a bunch of people. And the thing here is, and this is, I think, where it gets interesting, is because they're not going to actually sue individual investors as much, and maybe one or two. But the basic idea is that they're going to want to try to sue Reddit. And that's the incentive for them, right? If you just look at where they're standing, Reddit is basically the most powerful, the richest player in this. It has also, in some ways, enabled this discussion that led to this massive financial loss. And so that's essentially what is likely to go down. Now, the thing here is that Reddit, and I say this with full knowledge of the context that comes with it, is a publisher. And so the thing here is that if you go after Reddit, there is this little thing called Section 230 in the US. And what that does is basically says that, listen, Reddit is just a platform where people have been saying this thing. So you can't basically hold Reddit liable per se. And that to me is how this is going to go down. And this is why Section 230 is important, because if people could sue Reddit or for that matter, most social media platforms or most internet platforms in general, going back from CompuServe to Prodigy to Facebook to Twitter to now Reddit, if you were to hold them liable for everything, for every time someone got offended on one of these platforms, there wouldn't be a business model, right? So that's basically where we're at. And over the next week, over the next month, we're going to see this thing play out, at least these lawsuits being filed, and then Section 230 being the defense shield. Now, I think there's some questions around whether this applies to only financial trading and to other hate speech as well. We'll get into that, Anirudh. I think you'll frame them better than I can. But that's basically what I predict is going to happen. Reddit is going to get sued, and then Section 230 is going to be back in the conversation again.
Okay. Now, Section 230 is an American law, of course, right, Rohan? So what if something similar to what happened on Dalal Street, for example? What would the situation be in India? What is India's perspective on whether these platforms can be held accountable? So we know that the US does not consider them to be liable for anything that goes up on their platforms. Does India have a different point of view? Because we've heard recently that an independent news outlet, The Caravan, had its Twitter handle blocked on apparently legal orders from the government. So does Twitter, for example, have an arrangement that requires it to take particular kinds of content off its platform if the Indian government requests it to? And does that imply that if it does not, then it's liable to be held accountable for stuff that continues to go up on its platforms?
Yeah, so there's two very different things that happened in case of the government asking Twitter to take stuff down and Reddit itself moderating stuff on the US. So let's get to Reddit first, right? What Section 230 lets Reddit do is that there's basically how do I say this, perverse incentive for platforms before Section 230 came in, which was that if platforms were to tamper or to edit the speech that was being said, then that would mean that because they had the power to do that and they didn't do it, that's a problem, right? So for example, a politician giving a speech on a TV channel, if that speech turns out to be, if it incites violence and the TV channel could edit it but did not, they would be held liable. And so the TV channels basically had an incentive to never edit anything because they didn't want to be held liable for whatever people were saying on them. Right? That was the incentive that was in place before. What Section 230 did is it said that you can edit stuff and you will not be held liable. So you can do this editing in good faith. That also applied to tech platforms, right? So in this case, Reddit can edit stuff that's happening on our Wall Street bets and not be held liable for it. Right? In the case of Twitter in India, what's happening is that we don't have a good Samaritan clause, a good faith clause, or whatever. Instead, what's happening here is that the government has decided that particular hashtags, particular accounts are affecting, and I'm saying this with air quotes, public order, sovereignty of India, relations with other countries. These really extremely vague terms are being affected by stuff that's being posted on Caravan India and some hashtags on Twitter, which to
Yeah.
me is not really. I don't know. I don't think it makes sense. Because how do you why would you block a hashtag? Because people can use the same hashtag to say stuff that's against the hashtag, and they can use the same stuff to say stuff that's for the hashtag. So how?
Which is precisely what happened, right?
Yeah,
With the CEO of Prasar Bharati being accidentally.
yeah. So that's the problem. And so instead of Twitter itself moderating stuff in India, it is the government telling Twitter that these are the handles I want you to take down, because if you don't take them down, I will send bunch of you people to prison, right? So extremely different cases. And so if India, let's say, had a good Samaritan clause, Twitter would decide out by its own judgment, its own best judgment, and say that, listen, I think these hashtags are being a problem, and by that I will moderate them, and the government wouldn't have to take action. But instead it's the government driving this here, and in the US Reddit doesn't actually have to. No, I'm not sure how good of a job I've done to explain this, but that's what the difference is.
That's kind of an interesting point, Rohan, because when you say good faith, good Samaritan clause, that means that the platform uses its judgment to decide what needs to be removed from its platform, correct?
Yeah, and they won't be penalized for that.
Which so I mean, who decides what good faith is? I mean, it occurs to me that while an American court might, for example, uphold democracy or something, when maybe using it might use that as a metric of good faith. It appears that Indian courts especially have a much wider conception of what democracy and human rights actually mean.
Well played with that one.
But yeah, I mean, let's of course not go down that path, but instead talk about the other angle that comes with this whole idea of intermediary liability, which is where exactly do you draw this line, right? So if it's okay for Wall Street giants to sue Reddit for ending up causing them financial damage, is it okay for, let's say that sometime in the distant future, in a utopian world where the Rohingyas have been allowed to return to Myanmar, let's say the Myanmar government says, hey, you know what, Twitter, you guys enabled the government to carry out genocide a few generations ago. Now we're going to hold you liable for causing the loss of human lives. How would that, for example, play out? Might it open a route today for civil society organizations to say that, hey, you see this hashtag led to the deaths of these many people, therefore we are going to sue Twitter for not taking it down? Do you see that as something that might happen in the future going forward? So, does this open the gateway for civil society organizations to be able to sue platforms saying that their activity or inactivity led to human lives being adversely affected?
So the thing here is that, listen. So let's try to answer two questions, right? The first one is, what is good faith? Who decides it, right? So because that's the first part of, can civil society organizations say this? So the thing here is that the people who came up with Section 230 are still alive, Chris Cox and Ron Wyden. And so they say that Section 230 gives platforms this shield basically from getting sued, right? But you've seen instances where platforms have actually not been using this good faith. There isn't a floor or a ceiling on how well they're using this shield to moderate content, right? And so because of that, this shield might be taken away, right? So we're not sure. So for example, Parler is a social media thing in the US. It does absolutely no moderation. As a result, it has been kicked off AWS and other cloud computing services, right? But can other NGOs say that you haven't been moderating enough, and this led to genocide and so on? The thing here is that it depends on what do you mean by you're not moderating enough, because every country has its own standards, right? So like the US has Section 230, India has intermediary guidelines, Myanmar, I imagine, has or is developing its own clause. Thing here is that the question is, what is moderating enough, right? If in case of India, it is you take down everything the government tells you to, and whatever you think is violating public order. In Myanmar, that standard may be different, and so these social media platforms basically have to make that call based on. So like I know that for a fact in Myanmar there historically haven't been enough moderators, and that's a huge problem and a huge cause of the solutions that's led
I mean,
to.
it seems like much of the third world, when it comes to social media, does not have enough moderators. It's mostly the English language speaking world that tends to actually bother. It's really only in the Anglophile world where Twitter seems to really bother about responding to public feedback or the lack of moderation.
So basically, let me try to answer your question with a question. What is the definition of enough? If social media platforms are not moderating enough, what is the definition of enough? And that definition isn't clear across countries. So that's basically where we're at.
Okay, sure. Pratik, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so to your point of will, the way I see it, right, and I haven't specifically checked what clauses or what laws Wall Street companies are using to go after Reddit, but I assume they're going to be some very security focused laws which may not be applicable at least today in any other scenario, right? So, and you already have a lot of NGOs and civil society groups who are repeatedly calling out Facebook and various social media companies for their lack of activity. I won't say I won't say lack of moderation, because again that's a very nuanced category to go into. But let's just say lack of activity to prevent harmful content uh, on their platforms. I don't think today there is any grounds for any of them to have to take any of these companies to court, right? Purely because of things like Section 230. And in other countries, I suspect there could be various local factors that determine that. Because for example, I didn't see a single company in India also challenge the fact that they were banned, right? And we have discussed this before. For example, TikTok's difference to an impending ban in the US versus what happened in India, right?
Yeah.
So I think there are different factors at play in different countries, but as things stand, a lot of this is driven from, as you said, the Anglophile world, right? And my sense is that there isn't enough legislation there aren't the laws in place today to enable these companies to be sued for this kind of action today. That, of course, does not mean that these laws may or may not be enacted in the future, and it's going to be very hard to forecast what kind of incentives and what kind of consequences a regime like that will create.
All right, interesting. So, Rohan, what are your final thoughts before we wrap up?
Hey, my final thoughts here are that I am always amazed by the kind of stuff that Reddit manages to pull off, having been on there for some time now, and it's the first, at least in my memory, that something like this has happened. It's gonna cause a lot of debate on content moderation, especially on intermediate liability, and I cannot wait to be looking at the Section 230 debate again, and also this makes India updating its intermediate guidelines more of it gives it another challenge that we have to overcome. So yeah, exciting times ahead.
All right. So watch this space carefully. Like the rest of you, we're all active on social media. We're all watching the very historically consequential things that are happening around us every day, and we'll have an opinion on this broadly every week. So, and on that note, thank you, Pratik and Rohan, for joining me, and thank you all for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Storytel and TheWholeTruthFoods.com. So, great week on the network. Number of really, really interesting shows for you guys to check out. Here are a couple of the ones that I would like to highlight for you. Check out This Round Is On Me, Gauri Devi Dayal talks to her husband Jay Yusuf about mixing business and pleasure. They're the husband and wife business partners at Food Matters Company. Give it a shot. Really fun show. On Naan Curry, they speak about chaat, the queen of the street foods. A fun episode. They canvass the beauty and romance of street food, its cultural importance in a city, and they also discuss the unfortunate harassment that street vendors sometimes go through. On Paisa Vaisa, we had Madhuchanda. They joined Anupam talking about the budget and the different aspects of it. Storytellers and Storytellers features Shreyansh Pandey, creator of Gulak. A great conversation and some interesting insights into facilitating and nurturing writers. Do check that out. On Thale Harate, the Kannada podcast, Mansi Prasad spoke to Pawan Srinath about the history and appreciation of Indian music. It's a really interesting conversation. They discuss classical music and how it evolved in India, what are the various musical instruments and how they developed. Really, really fun, interesting stuff. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
Working Monday to Friday glued to your chair making you feel dull? Worry not. Get your 5-minute weekly dose of travel around the world with Postcards from Nowhere. Join me every Thursday as I explore the strange, obscure, and fascinating parts of the world and bring out facets of travel you may not have thought of before. You can find us on the IBM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.